Hello, my name is Craig Savage, but you can call me Doc, and welcome to another episode of Real World Analytics, or What Schools Don't Teach You. If you've seen my FAQ, there's a number of things I want to cover in this series, and today I want to talk about end-to-end processes. So if you haven't seen my processes video yet, I recommend you go watch that first, but if you're familiar with business processes, if you're happy with process maps, this should be fine. And so what do I mean by end-to-end? What's different about this? So I'm going to look at things at a very high level across the entirety of my project. Now, what does that mean? Everything. Is that from requirements to deliverables? So what I want things to do all the way up to me delivering them, or if I'm just looking at it from a data analysis perspective, from my input data to my model or final outputs. And today I'll be looking at kind of that second case. So I'm going to incorporate this into processes. So again, if you're comfortable with processes, this should be fine. If not, you can go watch it, and it's just going to be a high-level outline. So the specifics that I'm going to run into, specific problems that I run into, will present themselves, and I'm happy about that, but I want to have a high-level outline of how I'm going to approach these things. And I want to do that because I want to look for missing steps. So I want to be sure that I at least have an idea as to how my project is going to go. So why do I do this? Well, first I want to try to identify technical problems before they happen. So I don't want to be at a stage where I have all my data, I have my research question, but then I don't know what to do. And if you're going to share duties across teams, then you need to be sure that the different teams are going to build things that are going to fit together easily. I've had this in a number of cases when I was working on the Bionic Eye and in my first job as a systems integrator. And this can be things like people using different data sources, people using different variables on different time scales, people using different programming languages, so that when you, at the end of the day, when you try to put them all together, sometimes it doesn't work. And so by looking at things kind of end to end, you get the idea that, okay, I'm doing my work in R, you're doing your work in SAS, how are we going to share data? Before getting to the end and saying like, right, my code runs, your code runs, let's use them both. Oh wait, we can't actually. And I want to try to prepare and try to mitigate any non-technical problems. So you run into problems with sunk costs, that if we've been working for a month and we find out that actually we're going down the wrong path and we've just sunk a month worth of work into this problem and actually we're not really close to the solution. I want to try to remove that as a possibility. I want to have a plan end to end, and also just to set the expectations of, okay, in a month we should be this far along. This is what we're going to produce, and this is how it's all going to fit together. So how do we do this? So I'm going to start with a generic process, and I'm going to look for gaps and uncertainties. I'm going to try to include backups, milestones, and gates. And those terms, if you don't know what I mean, so as a backup, if I have an idea as to how I expect a project to work, for some reason it doesn't work, what's plan B? Does that mean that this stage in the process doesn't work and I need something new to fill in this gap? Or does it mean, right, this was fundamental to my entire project, and now as it's broken, I need to completely start over? And if I can have that discussion with stakeholders first, then we can set the expectations and realize that after a month in, we might need to just restart everything. And if not, let's talk about it. Along those lines, I can have milestones. So when will these intermediate pieces be ready? So after a month, how far along will I be? Will that be a report? Will it be an intermediate result? Will it be sitting down with stakeholders with PowerPoint? What am I going to do at what point in order to keep everyone up to speed with my progress? End gates. So it's one thing to have a milestone and have a backup plan, but to say, right, if in a month we write a report and we haven't gotten the answer, scrap the project, or go to plan B, go to plan C, reevaluate whether or not I want to keep going. And so it's a lot easier at the beginning. You set up that at some point in the process we're going to deliver a report, and then it's up to the steering committee, my management, whoever is in charge of the money to fund this project, and if I'm not far enough along, let's can it, as opposed to let's just keep throwing good money after bad. So from my modeling with impact, I had this process of how I was going to get to the answer. This is a slide from there if you want to go watch it. And I wanted to go through my thoughts of getting to this point, because I didn't just do this all in one go. So the first cut looked kind of like this. First of all, I'm going to work backwards. And so the end goal was to have this estimate of a lifetime loss. It's a accounting concept for a first 9, of which my modeling with impact projects is my modeling with impact talk is about. So one of the problems I frequently hate as a data analyst is when a client gives you a bunch of data and says, here, tell us something, because I want to start from the end and work backwards, and I don't know what that end looks like. So frequently when I'm in that situation, I'm going to go back to the client and say, right, so let's hypothesize what some of those end states could be. Do you want a model? Do you want some demographics? Do you want sales projections? Do you want profit projections? What do you want at the end? Because otherwise I could run down starting analyzing data and give them stats about how many missing values they have. But if they don't want that type of information, it's really not a good look at the end. So once I knew I had the lifetime loss, I'm thinking, well, what do I need just before that? And what I thought I would need is I would need a matrix that at any point in the future will give me a loss at that time, and then I can evolve it and get whatever time horizon I like over whatever lifetime of a product. So what would I need for that? Well, in the IFRS 9 standard, that you need to have an economic forecast. And here's when I ran into my first problem, that I didn't know how I was going to get this hypothetical economic forecast. I could kind of cheese it and say that someone tells me this is the number to use. It's for presentation, so I preferred something a little more interactive, so I wanted a web app or a Shiny app in order to say, well, let's make some forecasts and let's see what that projection looks like. So here I set myself a gate, if you will, that I said, right, I know Shiny, I'm confident that I can get this working, so I'm going to give myself 4 hours. And if I don't get it done in 4 hours, then I will go back to this. I get a number from somewhere for purposes of this presentation. So then what did I need to get those economic forecasts? Well, I wanted this idea that if I could get economic conditions, that I could get a transition that says, right, if the economy looks like this, next month it'll look like that, your losses will look like this, and then everything will flow through. So I could get it kind of one step at a time. Now, unfortunately, while I knew I wanted this economic conditions to transition matrix, I didn't know how I was going to get that. So at this point, I needed to know something about what algorithms and data I'm going to use. I wanted open source data, but again, I had a backup plan that if I couldn't find freely available data on the internet, I could simulate it. I could just make something up. Again, it's not what I'd prefer for purposes of an interactive presentation, but it would work. So I was at this stage where I did some searching around and I found historical stage data. So how much of a bank's loan were good and active, delinquent, and impaired, the 3 stages I was looking at. And I had historical economic data. So from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, I had information on unemployment rate, interest rates, some other things that I thought characterized the economy, and I was looking at a way to possibly put those 2 data sources together to get some information on economic transitions, economic conditions to transitions using those 2 historical data sets. And I was looking into vector autoregression. Now, I've used vector autoregression a couple times in my professional career, but I'm by no means an expert. So while I thought this would work and I looked into it, again, I gave myself a cutoff. I said, I've got 4 hours to look at this, and if I can understand it well enough to use it and present it with confidence, I'll do it. And I still think there's something there, but alas, because I'm not an expert, I spent more of my 4 hours. I didn't feel confident. I didn't want to spend another hour or another 4 hours looking at it, so I stopped. Thought to myself, okay, that's not going to work for me. What else can I do? So I thought, well, if I could break this up into 2 parts, if instead of having economic conditions and historical economic conditions and historical stages and put them together, what if I have an intermediate result? So rather than try to put them together in one step, what if I first look at the stage data and then the economic data as 2 separate steps? So if I had the stage transitions and the economic data, I could build a regression model between those 2. So that would work. But then I didn't know what to do with that first part. How would I take my historical stage data and try to use that to model future stages and stage transitions? And so at first I thought, well, if I've got stages and transitions, maybe I could use a hidden Markov model. And again, like the vector autoregressive model, I've used hidden Markov models before, but less, and it was a long time ago. So again, I gave myself some time, and I couldn't find a way in which I was confident that it could work. Not that it can't be done, but I didn't feel confident for a presentation as to how to put it all together. So I'm back at the stage where, okay, what am I going to do? And I thought, right, I'll just write some optimization routine in order to say I've got this realized data and I've got steps from one step. I've got historical data from 1 month to the next. Arrived at an optimization model based on that in order to project forward into future stages. And I was confident that I could do that. And so this is the kind of final process map that I was using in my presentation. I ran into problems along the way, quite detailed technical problems. The optimization results weren't unique and it was dependent on what my initial guess was, but I picked an initial guess that I liked and used this process map all the way to the end. So while this is a very high-level map that I can use to predict problems, it's not the same as if I had gone down the road of trying to implement an hidden Markov model only to find that I really didn't know what I was doing and maybe the requirements of the algorithm, the assumptions and the data might not have been there, in which case I would have been completely lost. But at least here I'm familiar and comfortable with all of the mathematical techniques, and I knew I could get an answer that would be good enough to present. So what can you do? What can you do about building end-to-end processes? So think of a process. If you have one, if you watch the process video and you made a process about how you were going to be a student, use it. If you have a business process that you're using, if you go and Google data analysis process, you'll find some. But just check for unknowns. Where do you add backups? What milestones do you want to put in there? What gates do you want to give yourselves according to those milestones? And pay attention to decision making. There's a list of kind of cliches that I have here that I've heard from time to time. And if you get to a point where you're hearing these things, or these are the arguments you're wanting to make, be careful. That concludes another episode of Real World Analytics, or What Schools Don't Teach You. Thank you.